Good morning, guys. How are y'all doing? I hope everybody's doing well. We're going to continue with part two of our notes from our review of the eighth grade information. It's basically what we're building on, right? So last time that we talked about the ending of the revolution, which takes place in 1783. And now America has to figure out, what are you going to do with it? Okay, so basically you've won. This is all yours. Now, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to rule? How are you going to create a government? What kind of government? They have to start answering all these questions. So one of the things that they're going to look at is the government itself. How do we establish a government that is going to be protective of the people, but not a government like we just broke away from? We don't want a totalitarian system. Remember, a totalitarian system means there's one person or a small group that's in charge. Well, you don't want that. You want to be able to have a government that the powers are allowed to allow for protection, but not a government that has so much power that they tell you what you can and can't do on a daily basis. All right. So the first try at this is what we call the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation is our first attempt at self-government. Now, the problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it was really too weak. Remember, these are men that just fought this long, drawn-out war against the British. And so the fact that you saw people die on the battlefield for this idea of liberty. You saw people die for this idea of independence. So these are men that don't want a government that has a whole lot of power, because they don't want the U.S. government to be like the British government in regards to the monarch having so much power. So that's where we're going to see this first attempt. They basically gave all the rights to the states, because remember, we're no longer colonies. Now we're states. We're not British subjects anymore. We're American citizens. And so the Articles of Confederation basically gave all the power to the states. And the federal government really didn't have a whole lot of power. It couldn't tax, it couldn't do, things like that. So it's literally too weak. So it doesn't take very long to figure out, this is not going to work. So we call a constitutional convention, which we're going to have all the states are going to send representatives to the Constitutional Convention to try to rewrite the Articles of Confederation, right? So we're going to change some things and try to figure out how to make this work better. Once they get into the Constitutional Convention, what we're going to see is, of course, there's a lot of arguing going on. Remember, they're in the Northeast. In the summer months, it's extremely hot. You have arguing and debating that's happening. People walk out. This is not an easy process, right? So I know it sounds like it because we have to go over it so quickly, but this is a hard process. So you have all of these people with all these different ideas. How are we going to implement these ideas and make something that is good for everybody? And so the Constitutional Convention, they're kind of hashing it out. And then eventually what happens is they look at the Articles of Confederation and they say, you know what? It's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So they literally just tear it up and start over. And when you start over, we end up with what we call the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution has the preamble to the U.S. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, posterity being future generations. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And so the preamble, which is basically an introduction to the Constitution, kind of lays out what we're trying to do. Now, once the Constitution is kind of hashed out, you have it written. And remember, guys, this is one of the most amazing documents in world history. Other countries that follow in their independence after American independence will look at the U.S. Constitution. So when you go back and you look at constitutions from other countries that win their independence after America's Constitution is established, you'll find a lot of the same wording that's used. A lot of the new states that are created as America grows, if you look at their state constitutions, again, you're going to see a lot of the same wording because they're taking things out of the U.S. Constitution and implementing it into their state constitution, or if you have a new nation, implement it into their nation's constitution. So this is a document that has long ramifications. It touches not just America, but it touches the worldwide with what it's able to do. And this is a document that, like we said, it came about with a lot of debate. It came about of blood, sweat, and tears. I mean, people put a lot into the creation and the writing of this document. So when the document is completed, the Federalists will be those that will support the Constitution. They want it ratified as it is right then. The Anti-Federalist is a group that forms because they do not believe that the Constitution is complete. They think that it's leaving some things out and it needs to add before they will ratify it. Remember, to ratify means that your state is voting for, yes, you want that Constitution. And so the ratification has to go to each state. And so in September of 1787, the delegates declare the Constitution is complete. Remember, the preamble is giving the reasons for this new government, we the people. Every time you see that phrase, we the people, it is the U.S. Constitution, right? So even if I give you a piece of paper that has an entire preamble or the entire U.S. Constitution on it, as soon as you see we the people, then you know that they're talking about the Constitution, right? Now, the Constitution is absolutely amazing. What it does is it creates 3 branches of government. So we're going to have what's called the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. Now, the reason that the founding fathers are going to have 3 branches is they want these branches to check and balance one another, right? So we want the legislative branch to be checked by the executive and judicial branches. In other words, we want them to have to answer to each other. If you just have one branch of government, all of that power lies within that branch. But if I have 3 branches of government, I can spread that power out. And so if that power is spread out, then it doesn't end up in the hands of one person. And that's really what they were trying to do. Remember, they have fought a war to get away from a totalitarian system, a monarchy. And they really, really don't want this to turn into a monarchy or a totalitarian system where you have a dictator that's controlling everything. They don't want that. And so that's why you see the legislative, executive, and judicial branches created, is to be able to share those powers instead of having it all in the hands of one person. So this allows for what we call checks and balances. They check each other, and because they're checking each other and are not allowing one branch to have more power than they're supposed to have, it balances the power out. And when you have that balance, then it means that you have a government that is having to answer to other sections or other branches, and that's a good thing. That's what you really want. You don't want your legislator to have all the power. And remember, your legislator is the Congress. Okay, so legislation is written in Congress. That's where the laws are written, is Congress. Congress controls writing the laws and basically what we call the purse strings. In other words, they spend the money that the government receives through taxes. And so that's what your legislative branch is. The legislative branch has two houses that are a part of it. You have the Senate and you have the House of Representatives that are broken up within our legislative branch, right? But these are the people that are making the laws. The executive branch, that's our president and his cabinet, right? So with the executive branch, what you have is basically the person that is the face or the spokesperson for the nation, right? And the executive branch does have power. The executive branch has the power of the military. And so even though Congress does have some say-so in what happens with the military, especially with budgets and that type of thing, because they control the money, the executive branch basically the president is the one that has, he's what we call the commander-in-chief. He's the one that is the military answers to, is the commander-in-chief, right? So if he gives an order, it's as though it's coming from the commander, the main commander. And so the military will follow that order, right? As long as it's within certain boundaries, right? And then you have the judicial branch. The judicial branch is easy to remember. It starts with a J, just like a judge or a jury. And that's where judges and juries are working, is in the judicial branch. So basically what the judicial branch is going to do is they're going to interpret the laws. They're going to look at the U.S. Constitution and any law that's passed by Congress or the legislative branch, and any executive order that's signed by the president is going to be compared to the U.S. Constitution with the judicial branch. And so we have what we call the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court of the United States is the last voice on a subject. So you have a law that's written in Congress, it's passed through Congress, it goes through the Senate, goes through the House, it's passed, it's signed into law by the president, and then someone says, you know what, this is not a good law. This law is unconstitutional. And so they will take it to the court system. It can go all the way up and appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court can say, you know what, you're right. This is unconstitutional law. And they can declare that the law is unconstitutional. As soon as it's declared unconstitutional, then you no longer have the ability to enforce that law, right? So these three branches are basically balancing the power and checking each other to make sure that one branch isn't trying to get too much power, because that will happen. You will have groups that take control of certain branches throughout our history, and those groups will try to maintain more power over the other branches, right? So the checks and balances is to make sure one person doesn't end up with all the power. So the shared powers that we have is also going to be shared between the national government, which we call the federal government, and the state governments. That's like the Texas government, okay? And so they're going to share powers. So there's going to be certain powers that the federal government or the national government has, and there are going to be certain powers that the state government has. Now, this is going to be an area of contention several different times in our history, as states declare that the national government or the federal government is trying to usurp or take away rights or power that's supposed to be with the states. All right. So sometimes this is going to be an area of contention between the federal and the state governments. But for the most part, we're able to share that power and balance it still. All right. Now, remember, you had the anti-federalists who opposed the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Now, when they did that, what you saw was more conversation about, well, if you don't want to ratify it, why? What's wrong with it? And so they're going to come back with, well, what's wrong with it is that you don't have enough individual rights actually listed within the Constitution. Yeah, you give all kinds of freedoms and liberties to the American citizens, and you basically set out the power structure of the U.S. government. But what about the individual citizens? What are their rights? Specifically, what are their rights? And so what's going to happen is they're going to add our first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And that's what's beautiful about the U.S. Constitution, guys, is you can change it. You don't change the body of the Constitution. You're not going to go in and rewrite something. But what you can do is add to it. So this allows for when times change, when society changes, when you have a time period or an era in U.S. history where you realize, you know what, we are not protecting this particular group. We can actually add that to the U.S. Constitution to make sure that that particular group is protected. It's absolutely amazing and beautiful that this document allows that to happen, all right? And so it's not, you don't ever have to look at the U.S. Constitution saying, oh, it's just an old piece of paper, it's old piece of parchment, and it doesn't mean anything. It means everything, guys. It means everything. The U.S. Constitution is the law of the land. If we don't have the U.S. Constitution, we don't have laws in our country. And so you have to have this document. It holds our country together. It makes sure that our country stays a united nation. It makes sure that every single citizen of this country is protected under this document. So without this document, there is no legal protection for any of us. That's how important this document is. And so when the founding fathers looked at it and said, it's a great document, it's beautiful, but we can add something to it. So they're going to add that what we call the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The first 10 amendments are what's going to protect our individual rights as American citizens. So these are the things that, this is something, guys, that you need to know. Every single American citizen has to know what the Bill of Rights is, because if you don't, this is how people get their rights taken away, because they don't understand them or they don't even know that they have that particular right. Okay, so this is like your freedom of speech, your freedom of religion, your freedom of press, the right to assembly, the right to petition your government. Guys, that's all in one amendment. All of that is the very first amendment. And then you have the Second Amendment. We have the right to bear arms. And each one of the amendment is addressing an individual right that Americans have. And so these are so very important that we understand what they are. Now, I know when you become seniors, you're going to take government class, and they're going to teach you in depth about these amendments so that you know what your protections are, what your rights are. It's so very important that you know every single one of them. What rights do you have? What power does the state have? What power does the U.S. federal government have? So that if you ever get into that kind of a situation where you have someone who is trying to take that right away, you know first and foremost what the right is, and you know how it's implemented, and you know how it's protecting you, and that you have it, right? And so that's why it's so important that every American citizen understands what the Constitution is, what the Bill of Rights is, and how the government works, okay? All right, so we're going to move to our next slide. And basically what we're going to talk about, guys, is if the Constitution is so important, how did we come about it? If it's such an amazing document, did you just think that maybe it just fell out of the air? That, one day the men at the Constitutional Convention, it's just all of a sudden a piece of parchment floated down and landed on their desk and we had this amazing document. No. Remember, these are human beings. These are men that are, each one of them bringing something different to the table, different viewpoints, different ideas, different backgrounds. They're not all the same. And so every one of them seeing it from a different perspective. And you've got to take all those perspectives and you got to try to draw them and bring them together into one document. Not just a document, but the ruling document, the document that the whole nation is going to be founded on. And so you have to look at, okay, what was it that they looked at that helped them to create this Constitution? So this is where your world history is going to fall back in here, okay? So you're going to see ancient Greece and Rome. Remember, they went through, they practiced, or they actually walked through democracy, the creation of democracies, the creation of republics. Remember, a democracy means that every single citizen is participating. Each citizen had rights, and you do have people living in these civilizations that are considered non-citizens. If you're a non-citizen of Rome, then you don't have any rights under their legal system. You are second-class citizen, you're a non-citizen, so you don't have the same rights as a citizen of that nation, right? And that's how democracy works. Now remember, democracy is messy, because every citizen participates. So democracy is really, really messy because you have everybody being able to input or give their opinion on what they want to happen on certain issues. Democracy is something that works in the smaller formats. So if you have a small nation, a true democracy works better that way because you have fewer voices that are involved in what you're doing and the participation of it. The larger a country gets or a civilization or empire becomes, the less likely they will be able to stay with a true democracy, right? So you also have the republic. Well, in a republic, you don't have a king. You had two branches of government. The Roman citizens had rights, and the Roman law did not cover slaves, foreigners, or women. All right, so those groups were left out. But if you were a Roman man and you were a citizen, then you were protected under the republic. But if you were not a citizen, then you were not protected, just like you would see in a democracy. The big thing that our founding fathers are taking away from these ideas of Rome and Greece is the ideas of the participation. How do we get our citizens to participate in government and also have a strong enough government that protects the country, that protects the citizens? So you're trying to find a balance. Now remember, our founding fathers, they are well read. In other words, they have studied the Greeks. They have studied the Roman Empire. So they didn't just walk in one day and say, hey, let's create a democracy, or hey, let's create a republic. The reason that they can talk about democracies and republics is because they have read about them. They've studied them. They saw what they did that made them successful, and more importantly, what they did that caused their fall. And so they're looking at, how do you create something similar to this, but set up a system that doesn't collapse the way the Romans and the Greeks did. Okay? And so that's something that you have to remember. This is what's influencing the people that are writing the US Constitution. Okay? All right. And so another influencer that we're going to look at is John Locke. He's also going to influence the writings of the Constitution. The men that were writing the Constitution read John Locke. They knew his ideals inside and out. And so he wrote a book or a pamphlet at the time called The Two Treaties of the Government. And so his ideas are a social contract and a government with the priority to protect the rights of each citizen. All right. So those are the ideals that he has written about, that our founding fathers that are writing the Constitution have been influenced by. So Locke listed three major rights: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own property. Right now, these three rights that you see right here, those should sound really, really familiar to you. All right. We changed them a little bit to you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right. So you can see already how much he is an influence in our writings. Right. So the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to own property. Remember, a lot of people coming to the New World are looking for economic success. So that's why you see that right to own property. This idea that just because you're not born into a certain section of society does not mean that you don't have the right to life, liberty, and the right to own property, right? So that's huge and a huge influencer for those writing the Constitution. And then you have what he calls the natural rights of men. When born, God endows that man or that person with certain natural rights, right? And those natural rights are something that the government does not have the right to take away. So again, you can see the influence already just by looking at what John Locke said and already knowing what's in our Constitution, right? And what's in our Bill of Rights. So you can already see that he is a major, major influence for those that are writing the US Constitution, okay? It's basically, guys, if you have a government that's strong enough to give you every single right, then you have a government that's strong enough to take every single right away. So we want to say to our government, you don't get to have that right. You are not that powerful. You don't give people natural rights. Natural rights of men, that's something way bigger than you. That's something way more powerful than you, that every single human being has this natural right endowed upon them. Every single human being. And you as a government do not have the right to take any of that away. See how powerful that really is to a citizen of a nation, and how protective that is of citizens' rights. Okay? Now, we're gonna look at, again, you're gonna kind of have to jump into some of your world history here, guys. These are some of the documents that are going to shape the U.S. Constitution. We're going to give you some in-depth information about each one. And the whole point is hopefully for you to be able to see how history is interconnected, right? So yeah, we have a beautiful document called the U.S. Constitution, and that document is unique and different than any other document worldwide. But guess what? It's also a document that's been influenced by other documents. We've looked at what other nations did, especially in our case, the English or the British, because we can see the good and the downside of those documents. So we want to look at those, right? So you have the Magna Carta in 1215, the Mayflower Compact in 1620, and the English Bill of Rights in 1689, all right? And so we're going to look at each one of them. So basically what you have here is you have the Magna Carta here, you have the Mayflower Compact here, and then you have the English Bill of Rights shown here. And these three documents help in the creation of our Constitution, of we the people of the United States, and the creation of that, okay? So let's look at some of the ideals of them. We have the Magna Carta. Remember, you have to jump way back in history to get to the Magna Carta. And so in 1215, we have what's called the Great Charter. You have some English barons that are able to defeat King John in England. Remember, you're still in England. And they force him to sign what's called the Magna Carta. And this is basically the very first model that we have, or the first step towards a more democratic government. And so the Magna Carta became part of the British Constitution. So when people first settled in America, remember, we're English citizens. So the men that are writing the U.S. Constitution, many of them are lawyers. And so they have this background. So when they look at the Magna Carta, they're saying, okay, so this is part of British law. Is there anything in British law that we can take that is good? And so they look at it and say, well, what about the ideals of the Magna Carta? The fact that you had limited government. You're stating that the king doesn't have complete rule. We're going to see rule of law, right? You have this idea that the actual supreme power is in the law, not the individual, right? And so you allow for individual rights. And so in the ideas of the Magna Carta, you had two branches of government established in Great Britain. So you're going to have the king or the monarch, and then you're going to have the parliament. And remember, their parliament is their legislative branch. They're the ones writing the laws and that type of thing. But they only have two branches under the Magna Carta. So if you only have two branches, then you can have a stalemate, right? You can have one side that wants something and the other side wants something different, and you don't have any way to break up that issue, all right? So the ideals of the Magna Carta are good, but you can kind of see some problems with it. So they say, okay, we want to look at the limited government. We want to look at the rule of law. We want to look at the fact that you do have shared powers, okay? But we don't want the Magna Carta. We want something better. So let's look at, what about the Mayflower Compact? Well, the Mayflower Compact is actually the first British citizens that are showing up in the New World. These are what we call our pilgrims. The pilgrims landed in Cape Cod. Remember, they had been blown off course, and they end up in what's called Cape Cod there. And on the ship, see, everybody believes that on the ship that you had all the Puritans. All the Puritans showed up on the Mayflower. Well, that's not true. The Puritans came on different ships. Yes, there were Puritans on the Mayflower, but you also had non-pilgrims. And remember, our Puritans are the ones trying to escape persecution. So they're looking for religious freedom. They're looking for a land where they can practice their religion in the way that they believe is biblically correct. And so they're pushing back against the Church of England, which is mainly controlled by the monarch. Excuse me, sorry. And so the Puritans are there, and they're here for religious freedom. But there's also on board non-pilgrims, and the non-pilgrims are not following the same religious pact of the Puritans. But they all realized very quickly that if they're going to survive in New England, especially during the winter, they're going to have to stay together. If they get off the ship and set up different homesteads and colonies really far away from each other, they're not going to make it. It's a new world. They're trying to figure out new ways of doing things. They're having to deal with Native American groups. They're coming in contact with new people. And so if they just get off the ship and all go their own way, they're probably not going to make it. So they do something amazing. They sign an agreement with one another before they left the Mayflower. And they said, basically what we're going to do is we're going to sign this agreement, whether you're Puritan or non-Puritan, and we're going to set up a government that allows us the opportunity to protect each other, but to have rules that we can all follow. And so they signed the ideals of the Mayflower Compact are basically the consent of the governed. The people form the government. So the government's authority is going to come from the people. And that is instrumental in the creation of the U.S. Constitution. Because what do you hear every single day? The government does not control us. We control the government. Well, that means that when the government does something, they have our consent to govern. So in this instance, what you have is you're going to see, they're going to elect leaders of their group, that those leaders are only powerful, they're only have enough power that the people are giving them, right? They're consenting to allow them to have some power within their structure. They also signed wanted what they call the social contract. Now remember, this is like John Locke's social contract. This is an agreement between the people and the government. So we're basically saying, okay, we're going to give you power. We give you the consent, and you're going to be able to rule, but you need to make sure that you are following all the same laws that the rest of us are following. Okay? And so then you're going to see what we call the rule of law. All agreed to follow the laws passed by the government. Okay, so all of those men and women, okay, that were on the Mayflower said, okay, these are the rules, and we're all going to follow these rules. If we don't follow these rules, these are the consequences, and these are the people that we're going to elect that will enforce the rules and the consequences. Right? So the Mayflower Compact is going to influence how the U.S. Constitution is written. So you can already see that the Magna Carta and the Mayflower Compact has a huge, huge influence in those that are part of writing the Constitution. Okay? And you should also start to see that these documents are similar to each other. They're taking some of the same ideas, they're using them at different times, but they're using kind of these same ideals that we want for our government. Okay? Then we're going to see what's called the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Basically, what you have, remember, you're in Britain. Okay, this is not American. This is British. King James wanted to restore Catholicism. Right? He's an absolute monarch. Most of the people living in Britain at the time are Protestant. They're under the Church of England, which is who the Puritans are trying to get away from. And the king shared power with Parliament. So the English Bill of Rights, what they wanted to try to do here is make sure that the Parliament still had some power. Because what King James is going to try to do is suspend the Parliament. If he suspends Parliament, it means that they don't meet. And if they don't meet, they don't write laws. And if he can get them not to meet, he can overthrow them. All right, so that was what King James was trying to do because he didn't want people to be Protestant. He wanted them to be Catholic. And he was willing to force every single British citizen to be Catholic. But most of the people living in Britain at the time were not Catholic, and they didn't want to be forced into worshiping in a different way. So when King James tried to suspend Parliament, he tried to force Catholicism on his subjects, there was a rebellion. People rebelled against this idea. And so they wanted a new crown, someone else to rule their country. So eventually what's going to happen is we're going to end up with William and Mary. as the new king and queen of England. They are both Protestants, but in order to take the throne, William and Mary had to agree to sign the English Bill of Rights. And so this is what in Britain, it's known as the Glorious Revolution. It's glorious because there's no bloodshed. They basically just overthrew King James and implemented two new people to the throne. And it is a revolution because it literally overturns the power structure. And what we're going to do is we're going to see an end to the divine rights of kings and queens. Up until that point, the kings were able, or the monarchs were able to rule because they basically told their subjects, I'm the king because God wants me to be the king. And you're not the king because God doesn't want you to be the king. I am a divine person, and therefore I am the king of England. And so the Glorious Revolution brings an end to that idea because they're going to take William and Mary and they're going to put them on the throne, and they are not considered divine as part of the throne. Okay, so it turns things upside down, and it turns England into what we call a constitutional monarchy. Now, that's important because this means that with the English Bill of Rights, what you've done is you have established a new governmental system. It has a constitution. It still has its king and queen, so they still have the monarch, but they have a constitution and they still have their parliament. So the ideals of the English Bill of Rights, you can see what our founding fathers would have gotten by. All right, remember, our founding fathers are lawyers, and they were British citizens before they were American. And so that means that this, what you see right here, these ideals that we see right here that are coming from the English Bill of Rights are something that they were immersed in. They absolutely knew all of this information, okay? So they're going to believe in a limited government. The king was subject to all laws, and he had to swear to uphold the British Constitution. By being subject to all laws, it means that he can't just pass a law randomly and not be subject to that law. So he can't say nobody can wear purple except the king. Oh, no. That's not okay. You can't pass that kind of law under the English Bill of Rights, okay? And the king cannot suspend the laws of Parliament. In other words, if Parliament passes the law, the king doesn't like it, too bad. He's still subject to the law, just like all the rest of the British citizens. Okay? With their Bill of Rights, they gave certain rights guaranteed to every man. They set up their social contract. The main purpose of the government is to protect the rights of the individual. And you have the representative government, the people represented by those in Parliament. So the people elect somebody, and then that person goes to Parliament and represents those people. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it really, really should. Because you're going to see that we took a lot of our ideals from the Bill of Rights, okay? Or the English Bill of Rights, sorry. Now, these are some fun facts about the Constitution. You don't have to write these down in your notes unless there's one of them or a couple of them that you just find really interesting, all right? But the Constitution is the oldest written constitution in the world, and it's also the shortest, right? So it does have some flowery language in it, but it's pretty much concise and to the point. This is what we're going to do, right? We've had more than 10,000 amendments that have been proposed to the U.S. Constitution. Only 27 of those have been ratified. So think about that, guys. Since the 1780s, we've only added 27 amendments, and the first 10 were added at the end of the writing of the Constitution, right? So it's not easy to add something to the U.S. Constitution. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. How many times is the word democracy mentioned in the Constitution? So what do you guys think? Just say a number out loud. How many times is the word democracy mentioned in the Constitution, do you think? The answer, 0. The word democracy is never written into the Constitution. Remember, we are not talking about a democracy. We are talking about a republic. So the U.S. Constitution is establishing a republic. It is not establishing a democracy. Now, do we have ideals that are part of democracy? Yes, absolutely, right? So And remember, democracy, it usually gets very messy and chaotic very fast. And in a nation our size would probably not work. You would have anarchy probably within the first 20 years of implementing true 100% democracy in our country. So it would not be a system that would be productive. Let's see. The original Constitution is kept in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and at night the document's lowered into a vault that's capable of surviving a nuclear attack. That's how important this document is. If you've ever been to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., it's amazing to walk into. It has an entire room that's just for the U.S. Constitution. It is protected. There's been damage to it because of the document. It is a document. It's written on parchment. And so there is damage that's been done to it, but you can still read every single part of it. And it is protected because it is so valuable. Remember, this is what everything in our country is based on, is the U.S. Constitution, right? It was written in the city of Philadelphia. That's where the convention was taking place, the Constitutional Convention. The oldest man to sign it was Benjamin Franklin. He was 81. And the last state to ratify was Rhode Island. They actually did not send a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, so it took them a lot longer to be able to get the document or the information about the document and be able to actually talk it out and decide if they were going to ratify or not. So they were the last one to ratify, was Rhode Island. We don't actually know who the person is that wrote the entire Constitution. Like, we know that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the main author of the Declaration of Independence. But we don't know for sure who was the actual person that sat down with that parchment and actually penned it. We believe that it was Governor Morris from Pennsylvania. We believe that he was probably the person that wrote it. But to be 100% historically correct, we can't tell you that he is the person. James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution because he had detailed journal during the convention, and he wrote the Bill of Rights and many of the Federalist Papers. When you get into college and you get into your history classes, you will be required to read the Federalist Papers, or at least sections of the Federalist Papers. And he is one of the main authors of that. And so he's considered one of the fathers of the Constitution as well. And the Constitution, like I told you earlier, has influenced the writers of almost every other written constitution in the world. So this is a document that has such a lasting impact, not just on our country, but on countries around the world. It truly is a beacon of liberty, a beacon of ideals for individual liberties and individual freedoms. Now, have we always lived up to these ideals? No, we have not. But what's beautiful about our country is that we keep striving for those ideals, and that the Constitution kind of establishes that for us and helps us to understand what is it that we're trying to become. What kind of country do we want to be? We're a nation of laws. That's what we are. How do we know that? Because the Constitution is the ultimate law. It's what we continuously go back to compare anything new that we do. We compare it to the Constitution because we know that the ideals of that Constitution are based in liberty and freedom and individual protection. And so that's what makes it so very, very important. Let's see. All right, we're going to stop right here, and then we'll do the last part for you on a separate section for you guys. Okay, and so I make sure again, just to make sure you know, just make sure that you're copying these notes down, that you have them written in your spiral in your journal, so that you can always go back to them, right? So the more you have, the better when it comes to taking our STAR test and taking our other tests. Okay? All right, we'll see you guys in a little bit, and you guys take care.